I'm Jonathan Tomkin from the University of Illinois. In the previous lecture, we discussed how much of the world had experienced a demographic transition. That is, death rates declined, and so populations increased, but then birth rates came down as well, and so now many countries in the world have birth and death rates that are now at a new, lower level and are not experiencing much population growth. Much of our worries about sustainability are connected to population growth. Are we going to have a J-shaped growth curve that's exponential, leading to an inevitable crash? Or will we have more of a soft landing, if you like, with an S-shaped curve where we grow to meet some kind of carrying capacity? So in this lecture, we're going to examine some of the forces that might be behind determining which trajectory the world's population will follow. Here we have a diagram of a large group of people in a big country. This is one of the things that's going on in the world today, is we're seeing a huge increase in urbanisation. So although some countries like China have very large populations, what we're going to learn is that this doesn't mean that they have very high rates of growth. What's more, it's possible to predict the rates of growth given both historical trends and the status of the population that we have today. These tools aren't perfect, but they give us a very good sense of some general trends for the next few decades. Here's a diagram which shows two photos. We have a young lady from Yemen and an older woman from Greece. It turns out that the median age, that is the person who is in the middle of the age distribution for Yemen, is 18 years old. Half of Yemen's population is 18 or younger. In contrast, Greece's population has a median age of 42.5. So just knowing this one fact, we can already think about what do we predict in terms of population growth for these different countries. Which group do you think is going to experience the most population growth in the next few decades? I'm sure you picked Yemen. And this is actually something that demographers do when they look forward to the world's population and try to predict how it will change. Younger populations do imply higher fertility rates. Old people don't have kids in the same way that young people do. This is a map of the world that shows the average ages of different countries. Lighter colours mean younger ages, while the countries in places like Europe, Canada and Japan indicate average ages in the 40s, just like we saw Greece had an average age of 42.5. I'm 38, which means I'm actually the average age for the United States or for Australia. You can use this map to try and figure out if you're above, below or at the average age in your country. Using this map, would you predict fertility rates to be higher or lower in different countries? I guess you would. Which country do you think fertility rates is the highest in? You might have said countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Yemen, Sri Lanka or Afghanistan. Notice how the median age of people in these countries is in their teens. Very young populations with these averages below 20 years old have lots of potential for population growth because there's lots of people who have a long fertile history ahead of them. Here on this map we see the world fertility rates for different countries, and the hot colours, the purples, the pinks, the reds, indicate populations in which fertility is 4, 5, 6 or 7 births per woman. The darker colours, the dark blues, indicate places where there are 2 or less births per woman. And from this you can see the places that have very young populations also have very high fertility rates. And so we can see immediately there's a connection between the current demography, that is the current population age structure, and future expected population growth. Note also that the older countries have much lower fertility, those blue countries in this map. In many places, the birth rate is below 2.1. 2.1 is considered to be the population break-even point, if you like. That's the place where we have enough births per woman, 2.1 births per woman, to make up for the deaths that occur in a population. It's not exactly 2 because there is a slight imbalance between the number of women and men born, and we have to worry about things like deaths in childhood and so on. So many countries are below 2.1, which indicates that they're on track for either population staying the same or declining in the future. And in fact, we do see population growth rates that are negative in some countries. This is a map of population growth rates. Note how Eastern Europe, Russia and Japan actually have negative growth rates. In other words, their populations are declining. Young, high birth rate countries have high growth rates. So this means that some countries, again, the ones that we've been looking at earlier, Sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, Yemen and some other places, are actually seeing fast population growth. It's very unequal around the world because different countries have gone through different stages of the demographic transition. So what determines these high birth rates, and can they be changed? A lot of people spend a lot of effort trying to figure out policies that change birth rates. In some countries around the world today, in advanced economies, there's actually a lot of effort to increase birth rates. Australia has a baby bonus where you can earn money by having children. So does other countries like Singapore have lots of programs to increase their birth rates. On the other hand, other countries are looking at decreasing their birth rates, and of course China is the most well-known example of that. Are there other factors apart from these policy prescriptions that might do something to change birth rates? Well, one very clear relationship is that as countries become wealthier, their birth rates decrease. Here's a map of the total fertility rate, that's the children per woman, versus the GDP per person, so that's a measure of individual wealth. As we can see, the world average is a little bit above replacement rate, but there's a very strong correlation. As the GDP per capita increases, we see the fertility rate is much lower. And so there appears to be a point where countries become what we might describe as a middle income country, where the GDP is sufficiently high that birth rates are below the replacement rate, at or below the replacement rate, and there are some countries shown here. Notice also, if you look at the very poor countries, they are the countries with the very high fertility factors. As we can see by looking at this graph, the low GDP per person countries, the poor countries, are the countries with the high fertility factors. You might be able to see where the United States, as one of the world's richest countries, also has a relatively low fertility factor. But there are inconsistencies in this graph. For example, Saudi Arabia has a much higher fertility than other countries at a similar level of development, other countries with a similar level of GDP per person. Similar countries with similar GDPs have birth rates that are below 2, whereas Saudi Arabia's is close to 4, close to double that. So it might be that there are other cultural factors, for example, the social status of women, that also contribute to birth rates and fertility. When women marry later, they have less children. US women marry on average when they're in the mid-20s, and the US has a replacement fertility rate, that is, we're about 2 births per woman. The top 4 countries shown here have much lower marriage ages, as you can see, in their mid-teens. And so they also have much higher fertility rates. So again, we can see the social expectations of what women can do can be a big part in fertility rates. Similarly, education is seen to be very important, and there's a very strong correlation between increased education and decreased fertility. In all countries shown here, more education for women is associated with lower fertility. So to explain this graph, each of the countries listed has 3 bars. The light blue bar means that the woman has no education. The dark blue bar means that the woman has a primary education, and the grey bar means that there's a secondary or higher education. And as you can see, for every one of these countries shown, from Kenya to Bangladesh, as the amount of education for the woman increases, so does the fertility rate decrease. And so in some countries it's very close to the replacement rate for those highly educated women, whereas the less educated women are having very high fertility rates in these countries. You should be careful interpreting data like this. There's not necessarily a causal relationship that's direct. It could be quite complicated. For example, if you're in school, you're not having kids. And also, if you're in school, you're probably more valuable as an employee, so you might be working longer. So it could be that it's not the fact that the person gets the education, it could be the fact that they're being educated rather than having children and a family, or it could be rather that they're in the workforce later on rather than having children and a family. So we have to be careful about policy prescriptions from this, but nevertheless we can see a very clear trend. Given that the world today has recently seen a big increase in developing countries' level of wealth, human rights and education, does this imply that we would expect that rates of population growth will decrease in the near future because we're seeing these sorts of developments be in line with lower fertility? In the next lecture, we will make a prediction about what the world's population will be over the course of this century, and I will tell you if I think we're heading for a J-style crash or a smooth F-style soft landing.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.